Hello everyone, and welcome to session 3 of our 7-part BizFlow enablement series. In this session, we'll be in AppDev Studio, where we'll walk through using our data entities from our data model, which, as you recall, we created in session 2, to create our performance evaluation form and blocks. First, let's revisit the AppDev hierarchy. So as mentioned previously, the top of the hierarchy is our workspace, with a single workspace containing potentially multiple projects. Now, projects are made up of forms and blocks, with multiple blocks being combined to make up the individual forms. So going back to our real-world example, if our workspace corresponds to a single client, with projects mapping to contracts with that client, then the forms and blocks would be the individual tasks within that contract. So as mentioned, today we'll be spending most of our time in AppDev Studio, which is where we design our form. As you can see, the layout is as follows, and I'll go through in more detail the layout and navigation once we're actually in the product. AppDev includes many pre-built, out-of-the-box UI components, but can easily be extended to include custom ones. So AppDev utilizes open source technology so that users who are already familiar with CSS, Bootstrap, and/or React can create and publish additional components as needed. And in addition, rather than having to learn a new or even proprietary coding language, common languages and libraries are used whenever possible, such as JavaScript, SQL, and jQuery. As previously mentioned, forms are made up of many individual blocks. This not only allows team members to work in parallel on different sections of a form, but it also allows an organization to implement and deploy new forms faster by making use of pre-existing blocks. The other benefit is that this helps an organization provide a standardized look and feel, where forms created by multiple developers will look uniform if the blocks are the same, as well as an overall faster time to deployment. AppDev also offers flexibility in design choices as well as the flexibility to change, meaning that it can be agile and make changes to address preferences or a certain desired look and feel when architected smartly. For example, if you had architected your long form using blocks and now wanted to switch to an accordion view, you don't need to move all, let's say 38 or 100 or however many fields you have on that form. Rather, just the 4 to 5 blocks those entities are grouped across. And depending on the organization, some have really embraced this new mobile and tablet usage and may prefer the accordion or tabular view versus a long single form, which may be preferred by organizations that are still using desktops and laptops. Either way, we can easily adjust as needed. And this also allows us to implement show, hide, and disable logic on the sections and blocks to control what's shown for different personas and roles. And we'll actually be getting into that in much more detail in an upcoming session 6. So with that, let's transition over to AppDev. After logging in, let's first open the project manager. Just as we can create our workspace and projects here, I can also select a project and create a new form and block. For the purposes of this session, portions of this form have already been built out, so let's close the project manager and simply open our project. Under the Form tab, we see that we already have a placeholder for our form. And navigating to the Block tab, we see that the form has been broken out into these following sections. So one of the benefits of blocks, as mentioned before, is that blocks allow team members to work simultaneously. So rather than one person taking on the entire performance evaluation form and building it from the ground up, I can take the employee information block, and John, my team member, could take the performance information block, and so on and so forth. And once we're done each building our blocks in parallel, we can put the blocks together at the end to create our form. So with that, let's finish creating our blocks and our form, we still need to add the new entities we created during the last session and apply styling. First, let's open the employee information block so that we can add the newly imported employee email address entity. As you can see here, most of this block has already been built out, but to add the last entity, we're going to navigate over to the Project Schema tab on the left, and this here contains our data model. And since we're looking for an employee-related data entity, we'll expand the employee information group. And so here, this is another best practice and why we recommend using entity groups rather than just having all of the entities under the root. So our project has roughly maybe 30 or so entities, so it wouldn't be too bad to have to scroll through them. But for a larger project or form with hundreds of entities, it's much easier to find the one you need if they're grouped together logically. So with that, I'm going to select the employee email address and drop it into the desired location. And immediately we can see that the layout isn't correct. All of our other fields are structured so that the label and field or UI component are inline vertically. So to apply that same styling to our email address field, we're going to navigate to the Layout tab on the right. And here we have pre-built options that we can select from. L stands for label, C stands for the field or UI component, and V stands for validation, which we'll get into more later. Since we want the label and component stacked vertically, we're simply going to select that option and click Apply. Now, since our field is laid out correctly, once again with the label on top and the field component on the bottom, we can see that the label itself has just currently carried over the name or ID of the entity, which isn't very helpful for our end users. So previously in session 2, when we were in the Universal Data Modeler, I mentioned that the fields can be labeled directly here from the studio. And to do so, we simply have to click into the label, delete and retype. In this case, we want it to be email. So that way, when a user is looking at this field, they see that it's under the employee field set. Therefore, this is the employee's email address field. With that, we are done creating our employee information block. So just as we did in the Universal Data Modeler, we're going to save our changes. Now here, while we're on this block, before we move on, just as an exercise, let's say we want to recreate this exact same employee field set below here in the canvas. Now this is just for exercise purposes, but there are true real-world applications for this. So one is, right now in the employee information block, we're collecting some high-level information about the employee, their name, their email, their position title, etc. But let's say we wanted to delve a little deeper, and in this same block underneath, we wanted to collect their position number, their position description, as well as their supervisor, and we wanted to lay out those entities in kind of a similar field set with the entities in kind of a grid-like layout as here. So that's one real-world application. Once again, for this exercise, the intention is just to recreate this exact same field set with the exact same fields. And there's two ways to achieve this. The first is to simply select our field set and using our copy, cut, and paste features above, copy everything, click into the canvas, and as you can see, there is a green dotted border around the UI component we've copied. And then we're going to hit paste. So in doing so, it really is a true copy and paste function. All of the layout, the entities, the styling inherent to the employee field set has been carried down. So that's one option, and this is probably the best way for the real world example I had mentioned before. So from here on, users could rename this field set. If we were collecting position information, maybe this would be position, and then replace all of these employee entities with the position ones. The second way to recreate the employee field set is by dragging and dropping the individual UI components and entities from our tabs on the left. So first, to get our field set and these grid layouts laid out, I'm going to navigate over to the Component tab, and here we have all of our UI components grouped across these categories. So the first one we want to drag over is the field set. That's this border here. So I'm going to select field set and drag and drop it in. So for this one, under the Attribute tab, I'm going to rename it to Employee. And I'm also going to set the toggleable feature from true to false. And toggleable simply refers to this expand and collapse feature that all field sets have. But we want to toggle that to false. Also going to change this condition inherit feature from false to true. This just means that any styling or any conditions, any logic we apply to the field set will carry down into the individual entities and the grid layouts underneath. So it's little things like these where the copy and paste feature really come in handy, where you don't have to make those individual selections from the Attribute tab or the Layout tab. It simply knows to copy everything down exactly as is. So now that we have our field set, let's populate it. And if you can see here, we have two grid layouts. One that's one row with 4 columns and another that's one row with 3 columns. So I'm going to select our grid layout from the list on the left and drag over 2 into our field set. So again, this first one, using the features we have in the Attribute tab, I'm going to reduce the number of rows and increase the number of columns. And for the second, I'm going to also decrease the number of rows, but I'm going to keep the automatic 3 columns that it comes with. So hit apply. So now that we have everything laid out, the field set is structured properly, we're going to populate it with entities by navigating over to the Project Schema tab. As you can see, we already have our employee information group expanded. So I'm going to select our entities and just drag and drop them in. All right, so we have all 4. And just as we had to do for the employee entity, we want to make sure that these entities are laid out correctly with the label on top and the component on the bottom, so vertically stacked. So I'm going to select our first one, employee name, go over to layout, select our vertical stack option, hit apply. And we want to do the same thing for all 3 of the remaining entities, but rather than me having to click into the entity, select the vertical stack option and hit apply, so that's 2 clicks, I can actually use this recent layout and style button. And you can kind of think of this as a paintbrush feature, kind of like in Microsoft. So I simply have to select my entities, hit recent layout and style, and without even me having to click apply or anything, it knows to use the same layout that we applied to the first entity and simply carry it over. All right, so now all of our entities are in the right cells. They're all laid out correctly. The last thing we want to do is, of course, to give these more user-friendly labels. So first one is name, email, position title, and office. And with that, we've walked through duplicating the employee information field set twice with 2 different methods. The first one we simply copied and pasted over, and the second we were able to recreate via the individual components and entities we dragged over from the left. So since we don't actually want duplicates for the real form, I'm going to go ahead and delete them. And of course, as always, save our changes. So next, let's open our performance information block. So navigating back over to the left, selecting the Block tab, and clicking the Performance Information block. And as you can see, that gets opened up in another tab, so we can navigate back to the Employee Information block if we need it. And here, let's add the 2 job knowledge qualifier fields that we added in the Universal Data Modeler. As you can see, we already have all of our entities for the work quality and communication and team building qualifiers. So to add another row for our job knowledge fields, I'm going to click on this grid layout, navigate over to the right, the attribute tab, and just as we did when we were recreating the employee field set, I'm just going to use our toggles here to add another row and hit apply. So in this row, I'm going to go over, hit project schema, collapse the employee information, expand performance information, and drag and drop the 2 job knowledge fields we created. So this one's the rating field, and this one's the, this one's the comment field. So this time we don't want any labels for these 2 fields, as you can see in the other 2 qualifier fields. It's just the component. So same as before, I'm going to select the entity, navigate over to layout, and this time rather than the vertically stacked option, I'm going to select the icon that just has the C for component and then hit apply. And we're going to apply that same style to the other entity, and of course I'm going to use our paintbrush option. So here we have our job knowledge entities in the screen, but we want to make sure that users know what these fields refer to, what qualifier these fields refer to. So we want to give a label to this row, just as we've done for work quality and communication and team building. And I can come over to the component tab and look for the label component and simply drag and drop this one over. Or I can also use our copy, cut, and paste features, which is actually what I'm going to do just so that I can keep and carry over all the styling that I've already applied to this label component. So same as before, I've selected the label component here, and I can actually tell the name of the UI component by this, this text over here. So this tells me that this is a label component, and actually if I click out to the grid layout, that changes. So now I know it's a grid layout component. So that's actually helpful whenever we're looking at a new form and we're trying to deconstruct it or recreate certain portions of a form, which maybe a teammate has created, to see which components they've used. So that's just a little tip here. So going back to copying over our label, let me select the label. Again, we're going to use our copy and paste features here. I'm going to take the duplicate, move it down into the cell below, and to relabel it, because this row isn't communication and team building, it's job knowledge, I'm going to go over to the attribute field, and in the content section, I'm going to simply select what it currently says, which is communication and team building, and replace it with job knowledge. As you can see, there's already some, and this is what I meant by carrying over the styling. We'll actually be getting into this a little later in today's session. Let's hit apply. All right, so that concludes all of the changes we want to make, or additions we want to make to the performance information block at this time. So we're going to save. So now that we've created all of our blocks, we're going to navigate to our form. And here you'll see that we've already started creating the header and the borders for our performance evaluation form. And if I click into the components, you'll see that we're using the scroll panel UI component, and we've already started to apply some CSS styling via the attribute tab on the right. For our logo, since we've already dragged and dropped the image component onto our canvas, we just need to define what image it is we want to display. And to do so, we're going to quickly navigate back over to our Universal Data Modeler, select our project from the list on the left, check out our data model, and this time we're going to navigate to the File Manager tab. And here I'm going to select our project. We currently have no files, but this is where we upload any documents, files, or images that we want to use throughout our project. So I'm going to hit upload, and I've already downloaded a PNG file of our BizFlow logo to my desktop. So I'm going to select choose files, and select our BizFlow white PNG logo file. We're going to give it a title, something that we can reference it by later on. It's an image type, I don't need to change that. This tells me the size of the file. All right, everything looks good, so I'm going to hit upload. So now that our logo image file has been uploaded to our Universal Data Modeler, all I'm going to do is click Copy URI, which stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. Navigate back over to Studio, and in the source field under Attribute, paste the URL we just copied and hit Apply. From here, we can tweak the size and margins as needed. So now that we have our header and our borders and we have our logo, let's get the blocks we created, our performance information, our employee information, our achievements and goals onto the form. So there are actually two ways to add blocks to a form. The first is to simply drag and drop the block from the blocks list. So let's take the employee information and drag it onto the form. And what this does is it creates a separate copy of the block, a separate instance of the block in the form. But then any edits we then make in the block itself here are not reflected on the form's copy. So we don't want that for this one. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that block. We're going to use method number 2, which is to use the embed blocks component. So I'm going to look for it in our list. So here we have the embed block panel. I'm going to not drag and drop the block itself, but I'm dragging and dropping this embed block panel component to our canvas. And as I do so, it'll ask me which block I want to carry over to the form. And what this does, what the embed block panel does, is to create a visual link on the form to the block. So since we're simply linking to the block through the form, any edits we make on the block, so actually we can show it to you in real time. Let's say name, or let me change email address. So that's a change we've made directly in our employee information block. I'm going to save that. When I navigate over to the form, we even get an alert saying that the block was edited, and we see that the entity's label has been changed on the form just as we did on the block. So I'm going to go back over to the block, delete what we added, save again, and once again we get that alert. And similarly, we see the same edit here. So I'm going to do that for all of our blocks. So let me just keep dragging and dropping. So next is the performance information, and then the achievements and goals. And lastly, we have a review block for our HR and managers. All right. So now that we've embedded all of our blocks onto the form and we have all of our fields and entities, we can apply formatting and styling. But before doing so, I'm going to save our changes. Now we've actually already seen some formatting and styling elements. Navigating to our employee information block, we were able to control the layout of an entity via the Layout tab. We walked through relabeling a component via the Attribute tab. And we also changed the label of an entity directly from the canvas here. So expanding on these, under the Layout tab, we can also add padding and margins to an entity and also to our component. So if I select the field set component, I can increase our margins here. So from 15 pixels to, let's say, 30, and then same thing here on the bottom, or actually to the left here from 20 to 40. Hit apply. As you can see, we've increased the margins across the top and on the left. Under the Attribute tab, we can also apply HTML styling to a field set header. So let's say we're going to take our employee field set header. We've already toggled the use HTML title to true. And here we're going to bold and italicize our header. And as you can see, I'm using HTML styling here. Hit apply. We can also apply styling to the content of the field set, so the entities within the field set under the content style. And here we'll be using CSS keywords. So let's say we want to bold everything. And we also want to increase the font size of all of our entities from the current to, let's say, 18 pixels, or let's say 20. Again, we're going to hit apply. And as with our employee field set header, we can see all of our changes on the canvas in real time. We can also see it more in terms of how an end user would see it through the preview function. So from making the style changes to viewing them, I was able to do everything from the same screen without having to navigate to a different menu or window. This reduction in clicks and easy navigation means that users can not only make the changes quickly, but it also reduces the learning curve and how quickly users can actually pick up on the navigation, which ultimately means quicker time to deployment and to go live. Now, all of these methods are good for styling individual fields or sections, and it's really quick and easy, especially for prototypes and mockups. But for full-scale implementations or pilots, this method may not be ideal for long-term maintenance. What we mean by that is, for example, if we wanted to increase all of the field labels and the field set headers from 12 pixels to 16, we don't want to have to come in here and make that change to each and every entity and field set. So for those kinds of global styles, we can utilize the extend CSS. But before we do that, I'm going to close out of our employee information block because I don't want to save any of the styling changes I've made here in the attribute tab. So I'm going to close it. Changes have not been saved. Do you want to close? Yes, I do. Now, when using the extend CSS as best practice, we recommend you create a separate CSS block, apply all of the CSS styling to that block, and then embed the block directly into the form. So to do so, I'm going to navigate to our project manager, expand our workspace, expand our project, and then here select new block, name it. And you'll notice that I've named the block with an underscore, and that's just making use of the way AppDev automatically sorts the blocks alphanumerically. So this underscore will ensure that this block will always stay at the very top for easy access, and it just kind of helps keep it separate from the rest of our other more data entity related blocks. So I'm going to save. Yep. And this is what I mean. So the underscore CSS block gets auto listed at the very top, separate from, kind of visually separate from the rest of our other blocks. So now that we've created that block, I'm going to hit close, navigate over to block, open up our new CSS one. And here we're not dragging and dropping anything onto the canvas. We're not opening up the components tab. Rather, we're going to open up the extend CSS model via this icon up top. And here in the extend CSS area, I'm simply going to copy and paste some scripting that I've saved into the body. And here I just want to point out two things. The first is that we're actually identifying different elements of our components, our UI components, via these keywords, starting with the bf form.p-fieldset. So this one actually refers to the field set headers. This one refers to the actual data entry into the data entity components. This one refers to the entity labels. So if you're already familiar with these from previous usage of AppDev, that's great. Otherwise, for those who are not familiar with these, I will show you how to get them from the preview mode. And then the other thing I want to point out is that for those who are familiar with CSS, we're mostly modifying and increasing the font size of all of these different elements. All right, I'm going to hit apply. So this blue indicator tells me that we have unsaved changes on our underscore CSS block, which makes sense. We just applied our extend CSS styling. So I'm going to save our block, navigate back over to the form, and use the Embed Block panel component to insert our CSS block. And as soon as we do that, I hope you saw that the field set headers have all been increased in font size and bolded, and same thing for our entity labels. And if I start typing into the component of the entity, the font size of the data input, the input text, has also been increased. As I mentioned, if we navigate over to our preview mode, I can right-click on any part of the component. So let's say we want to identify the keyword for the field set header. Click Inspect, and that'll bring up your browser's dev tools. And here on the right is where you'll find the keyword. So since I right-clicked on the field set header, here we see what we would expect, which is the .p-fieldset-legend-text. And if I were in the middle of applying the CSS styling and I needed this specific keyword, I could simply copy it from here and paste it into the body of my script. So that's the first way to use the extend CSS, by using our kind of BizFlow AppDev keywords. The other way, for those who are a bit more CSS savvy, is to create a custom style class. So I'm going to close out of our DevTools here. I'm going to close out of our preview, and I'm going to save our form first. Again, that blue indicator, if you noticed previously, means that there are unsaved changes. So going back over to our CSS block, I'm going to reopen the Extend CSS Model. And let's say we want to create a style class to apply to all of the buttons on our performance evaluation form. We're going to click into the Extend CSS section. And first, we'll give our style class a name for us to be able to reference it later. So we're going to name this one .performance button. Hit enter. And for our buttons, let's say we want to change the labels to be larger and bolded. So using our CSS keywords here, font size, and we'll give that 25 pixels. I'll explain what this important tag is in a minute. We're going to give it a font weight, bold, and again, important. And for the buttons themselves, we want to make them very rounded. And let's also change the color from the standard color to green. So for the rounded edges, we're going to use the border radius keyword. And then for the color, background color, green. All right, so in all this, as I mentioned, we're using that important tag here, and that just lets the system know to override any existing underlying style that AppDev applies inherently to all of its buttons. So let's see it in action. We're going to hit apply, save the CSS block, navigate over to our form, and here let's just drag and drop a button for us to be able to test with. So we're already in the component tab. I'm going to delete embed, look for button. We'll just drag over the standard button here, and since we're not going to keep this one, I'm just going to drag and drop it directly onto the canvas here. And this is what I meant by the inherent underlying style that AppDev applies. Every button comes with this P button primary class that exists without having to be defined. So I'm going to get rid of that one, and we're going to replace it with performance button. And we're going to hit apply. And as soon as we do that, our button has now taken on all of the 4 attributes we've given to our performance button style class that we created. The font size has been increased to 25 pixels, it's bolded, the radius or the edges of this button have become very rounded, and the color is now green. So since we don't actually want to keep this for the real form, I'm going to select it and we're going to delete it. And that takes us through the end of session 3. So let's review what we covered and then briefly talk about what we're going to learn in our next session. So in this session, session 3, we were mostly in AppDev Studio, where we created our blocks using the data model we created in session 2. We embedded the blocks onto our form, and then we applied styling through the attribute menu, the layout menu, as well as the extend CSS modal for global styling. In our next session, session 4, we'll be in our BizFlow Process Studio, also known as BPS, where we'll be working through setting up our environment, as well as designing our performance evaluation workflow, the process that'll define how users actually interact with the performance evaluation form and what roles we have in the process. With that, thank you so much for joining us for this session, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.